Iranian nuclear capabilities and Iranian behavior to international and regional peace and stability. UANI also works to educate the public and investors and corporations and businesses about why Iran post-nuclear deal, post-Jcpoa remains a very hostile and treacherous and risky place to do business. And I think our program today, with a distinguished lineup of speakers, panelists, and moderators, will explore all these themes, and it should be of great interest to you all. Before we get started, just a few programmatic notes. If you want to ask a question during one of the Q&A sessions, the tote bags that you received at registration contain some index cards and a pen. If you have a question, please write it down, give it to the appointed staff member, and we'll make sure that the question gets in the appropriate queue. We would just ask that you keep the questions directed to a specific panelist, and also keep it relevant and germane to the topic of the panel. So Iran business, Iran's nuclear program, et cetera, et cetera. If you have things unrelated to Iran or those themes, maybe you can address it offline if you have a chance to run into one of our program participants. UANI staff are on the premises, floating around, roaming. They're wearing blue badges. If you have a question about the facilities or the venue or the program, please don't hesitate to ask. Just a reminder, at 1 p.m. there'll be a complimentary lunch served in the foyer right outside the ballroom right here. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. Thank you to UANI staff and the Roosevelt for putting this event together. Thank you to Jason Brodsky and Amanda Kuttner and others who worked so hard to put this event together. I'll now turn it over to UANI's chairman, Senator Lieberman, who will introduce the first panel. Senator.
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks very much. You know, life is so much about expectations. Ambassador Mark Wallace said to me as we waited to come on, there just aren't many people there because it's a tough morning in New York with the security threat and the weather. But I thought there'd be like 5 or 10. I'm very pleased to see this number, and the quality of attendance is quite high. I'm always reminded of the debate in the Bible between God and Abraham over how many righteous people it would take for God to save the sinful cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and it ended up at 10, so we're at multiples of that here this morning, and that makes me very optimistic about the future. I'm privileged to serve as the chairman of United Against Nuclear Iran, UANI. I've followed this organization since its founding in 2008 by people that really deserve the title statesman. The late and really great Richard Holbrooke, the former director of the CIA, Jim Woolsey, and Ambassador Dennis Ross, along with Ambassador Wallace. And they started this organization because of their concern at that moment with events in Iraq and Afghanistan, that there would be a pulling away from a realistic view of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the threat it represents to the world, and the multiplication of the threat if it ever attained nuclear weapons, and thus the title United Against Nuclear Iran. It's a nonprofit, private sector supplement to governmental action. It's an advocacy group. It's an educational group. Over time, it's concentrated specifically on convincing businesses that they were taking on very high risk, including not just business risk, but legal risk if they did business in Iran because of the sanctions that were passed by Congress over the years and passed by other governments in other parts of the world. In that regard, I think the organization, long before I left the Senate and became a member of the advisory board in 2013 and then chairman last year, really had some significant successes in convincing businesses that were trying to run the sanctions not to do so. The organization, to be as explicit as we can be, probably not surprising anybody here, strongly opposed the Iran nuclear agreement last year. In its aftermath, we have worked very hard, again, to remind global businesses that the sanctions for everything non-nuclear that is bad that the regime in Tehran does are still present, that they will still, if they do business in Iran, be supporting a government that represses the rights of its people, that is the #1 state sponsor of terrorism, and that has been an aggressor and a destabilizer in the region. And we've had some success. Most recently, we were proud that we were able to convince major international energy conferences focused on promoting investment in Iran to cancel their events, given the lack of transparency, record of money laundering, and terrorist financing in the Iranian economy. This conference is being held for two reasons today. One is that we have just passed the 1 year of the Iran nuclear agreement that, since it was agreed to, the Jcpoa, and it's a time, we think, to evaluate the state of the risk from Iran and what effect that agreement has had. And the second, obviously, is that this is the week of the United Nations General Assembly, and another reason why traffic is so bad in New York. President Rouhani is going to be here, and I think it's important for us to speak truth to power, both his and all the other power that will be represented here, about what this regime represents. I will say finally, before turning it off, you'll hear reference to this throughout the day, that UANI recently commissioned a poll of the American people to gauge their opinions on matters related to Iran and Iran's nuclear program. And the one element that stood out to me in the midst of an obviously tumultuous presidential campaign here in America, a very unsettled world, a lot of news coming in, when asked what was the nation that represented the greatest threat to the United States, #1, ahead of North Korea, ahead of Russia, ahead of China, was the Islamic Republic of Iran. Only a few points higher were the non-state actors of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which is quite understandable. So I think we've got, from the founding of the organization, as an American organization, it has become truly global, because the concerns about Iran and a nuclear Iran are obviously global, and we're very grateful that on this program today you will see leaders from throughout the world participating. So without further ado, I'm really pleased to turn this over to Ambassador Mark Wallace, our former ambassador to the United Nations, who's really driven this organization with great devotion and effect since its founding. And he will introduce really one of the great leaders of the diplomatic corps in Washington, and architect and supporter of one of America's most important bilateral relations, that is with the UAE, and that's Ambassador Yousef Otaiba. Ambassador Wallace, it's all yours.
I think the microphone is on, and thank you all for coming and braving the weather, the UNGA, and of course the unfortunate events that are happening in New York City while we're here. It's my great pleasure to moderate a discussion with my friend Yousef Otaiba, but let me give a brief introduction. It's going to embarrass him slightly. I think sometimes, probably embarrass you a lot, I think sometimes in our modern politics we overlook our allies and our friends. And there are certain countries that have really stood up to be very strong and powerful allies in the United States and have been with us through thick and thin. And I think my colleagues in our diplomatic corps and my government, we don't always do a good enough job acknowledging that, Yousef. And I just want to say, formally on behalf of the United States, and now on behalf of United Against Nuclear Iran, and I think of a lot of people that we both know, I just want to acknowledge the great alliance and friendship that we have between our two countries. That's about our countries. Now about you. We both know that the diplomatic corps is a colorful exercise. And there are times when certain ambassadors and certain diplomats stand out above. And we have gotten friendly over the years, Yousef, but without a doubt, in Washington, Yousef stands very tall and is one of the leaders, if not the leader, of the diplomatic community in Washington. I know he's already getting uncomfortable about that, but just because of his knowledge, his charisma and charm, and his wife, Abir is an incredible partner with you. But Yousef has done an extraordinary job representing his country and is really beloved and has an outside role in the Washington Diplomatic Corps. He formerly was a longtime advisor to Mohammed bin Zayed and now has been the ambassador. How many years now?
Just finished 8 years.
8 years. And God, I didn't think it was that long. But with that, I was hoping that maybe you could start with a few remarks about your thoughts on Iran, the climate since after the Jcpoa, and then maybe we can have a discussion and have some questions.
Thank you very much for having me. And Mark, I think we're off to a rough start because the secret I found to impressing people is setting the bar really low. And Mark has gone in the opposite direction and raised your expectations unreasonably, so I will try to do my best to keep you guys entertained. How does Iran look from the perspective of the UAE today, just a little over 1 year post-Jcpoa? So let me start off by saying something I was chatting with Jason briefly about, which is if you're the UAE, you're a small, wealthy country in the Gulf, second strongest economy after Saudi Arabia. You have a neighbor like Iran. If you look at the potential of a relationship with Iran, the positive potential, the amount of economic ties we can have, cultural, education, trade, the amount of business we can do with Iran, the upside for us is unimaginable. If Iran sought a healthy, productive relationship with its neighbors, if Iran acted in a more reasonable, moderate, measured, responsible fashion, the bilateral and the regional relationship with Iran could be literally a stabilizing factor in the region. But instead, we have a country 100 miles away from us that has been occupying our island since 1971, that has been belligerently hegemonic, not just over the last year. I would argue that it's happening over an extended period of time, but in a expedited way in the last year. We see a country that has remained on the US list of state sponsors of terror. We see a country that bluntly says we have been supporting groups like Hezbollah and Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We see a country that has tested more missiles in the last year than they have in the past 5 years. We see a country that has increased its military budget 10%. So the indicators, regardless of what barometer you use, has been a more hegemonic, belligerent approach, whether it's in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, and most recently in Yemen. So the perspective from the UAE, while the potential is really, really high, the facts on the ground are this is a country that has repeatedly shown that it doesn't want to have a healthy relationship with its partners.
Thank you, Yousef. Let's talk about sort of Iran's role in the world. And one of the dividing lines was obviously the adoption of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And whatever the views, people's views on the Jcpoa, there was a narrative that developed that Iran's behavior would change, that Iran would be a different state actor, a more conciliatory state actor. Talk to us from your perspective in the region, Iran today versus before the Jcpoa, on the adoption of Jcpoa. What's changed, if anything?
So it really depends on what the diagnosis is for why we think Iran came to the table in the first place. And personally, I'm not going to advocate the UAE position. I personally believe that Iran came to the table because the sanctions were inflicting so much damage that it put the regime at risk. It put the regime's survivability at risk. And so they sought a deal to lift the sanctions, which was their ultimate goal. And the narrative that you discuss is perhaps once Iran opens up, perhaps once businesses get involved and becomes a more open society, that is going to change from the inside. Iran is going to change. They're going to be forced to adopt various cultures and openness because you can't keep Iran closed off like this. Unfortunately, what we suspected would happen is exactly what happened. The deal was completed. Rouhani and Zarif were brought in to basically conclude the deal, have been marginalized by the hardliners, and if you follow Iranian domestic politics, they are under siege from the Khamenei and IRGC and Qasem Soleimani faction inside Iran today. Now, regardless of whether we think the Jcpoa was a good deal or a bad deal, it largely depends on where you sit. In our view, the Jcpoa was going to be a good deal if it allows us to focus our efforts on Iran's behavior in the region. If we say, okay, great, now we took the nuclear issue off the table, we're good for 10 to 15 years, let us now address Iran's behavior in the region, then we can mark this down as a good deal. But if we look at the Jcpoa, if we shift our focus and say, let's pretend we don't see what's happening in the region, let's pretend Iran's behavior isn't actually taking place because we don't want to risk the Jcpoa, then no, then this is a bad deal. So whether it's a good or bad deal largely depends on our policy towards Iran the day after.
It's a very interesting insight from being literally, I think, a very close neighbor. One of the arguments that we hear is that businesses and economic interests in Iran would somehow open and energize Iran to participate and moderate their behavior. I think one of the concerns that we've had, and we've seen this, and the debate about sanctions and their effect is one that is debated in diplomatic circles around the world. And I personally believe that sanctions sometimes work and they sometimes don't work. Sometimes they can hurt people unintentionally, and sometimes they can actually help inspire people. From our perspective, the reason why economic sanctions and economic isolation has had an effect is that the regime has done perhaps a better job than any authoritarian regime in history in infiltrating its people into the levers of economic power. As a close neighbor, as a trading partner, how do you see the IRGC, the Quds Force and others, and how they've infiltrated the Iranian economy such that the sanctions were targeted in many ways at those that controlled the economy, in this case, those that were the drivers of the revolution?
Yeah, so an interesting symptom of the sanctions was it actually empowered and strengthened the IRGC, because once the sanctions were put in place, the IRGC began to dominate the Iranian economy. And whether it was by design or by accident, that's what happened. So if you are a businessman in the UAE today, the sanctions have officially been lifted. I think the jury's still out, whether it's a businessman or a bank, whether the risk has decreased. I mean, there are reports that up to 70% of the Iranian economy is controlled by the IRGC. And we've talked to Iran. We have a relationship with them. So I can tell you from experience, concluding a deal with Iran is very difficult. They're very tough negotiators. So the reason many businesses have not flocked to Iran since the sanctions have been lifted has nothing to do with the sanctions. It has to do with, it is not a healthy climate for businesses. So while there might be, I think, maybe some small businessmen, individuals, family offices selling products or doing trade with Iran, I don't know of a single major UAE bank, of which there are about 54, that has chosen to go in and do business in Iran today post-deal, simply because the risk in Iran is still relatively high. Iran is still on the US list of state sponsors of terror. Iran has still supporting Hezbollah and Hamas. Iran has still continued to field their own military in Syria and in Lebanon and in Iraq. And so I have to, if I'm a businessman, I have to evaluate all those before I decide to invest or deploy capital in a country like Iran.
I think it was this morning or yesterday, it was reported that the Ayatollah made remarks suggesting that Iran wanted to be uninhibited in its operations in the region, basically acknowledging and admitting that they wanted to have a role, a much bigger role regionally than was present, than before. One of the things about the JCPOA, I think that was a concerning factor, was that it was limited to the nuclear file. Terrorism was not discussed, human rights, meddling in the region and the like. Why didn't Iran want to discuss those very important issues? And tell us about the role that Iran is now playing in the region as you guys, as your country, has troops in the field right now and are fighting causes. Tell us about the role of Iran in the region.
So my good friend Mike Morrell, who was the former deputy CIA director, penned a very interesting op-ed a few months back, and he said, sometimes we just need to listen to what our adversaries say, because they say exactly what they want to do. And he used the example of Osama bin Laden publicly claiming that he wants to attack the United States. And then what happens on 9/11? Osama bin Laden attacks the United States. Iran says what it's going to do. I mean, it's not subtle, it's not hidden, it's not a secret. They say what they're going to do. And again, when you're with the proximity that we have, we pay close attention. So I don't think there's any doubt about Iran's intentions in the region, at least not from the UAE. So the question is, how do we deal with that? And that's where, you know, the policy discussion comes in. But as a country that has fought in Yemen now for a little over a year, most of the casualties that we've had, most of the soldiers that were killed in Yemen, were killed by weapons supplied by Iran. I mean, that's a fact. They were intercepted, we've intercepted, the US has intercepted, Australia has intercepted weapons coming from Iran into Yemen with Farsi writing on it. So again, facts. This is happening. How we deal with it then is a question we should debate. But as a country that has suffered its first casualties and killed in action at the hands of Iranian weapons, it makes the issue far more clear for us. And again, it highlights the negative role that Iran continues to play in the region.
From that, let's go to Foreign Minister Zarif's recent op-ed in the New York Times that caused such a stir. You talked about the loss that your country has suffered in the region at the hands of Iran. What would you say to Foreign Minister Zarif if he were here in response to that very colorful op-ed in the New York Times?
Well, first, I think the best rebuttal was offered by my friend Adel Jubair. It's in the Wall Street Journal. I would urge all of you to read it if you haven't, because he does a very good job of responding point by point to the allegations made by Minister Zarif. But my personal opinion was it's a very, very extreme case of the pot calling the kettle black. I think it's the definition of irony when the foreign minister of Iran calls out other countries for support for extremism. I think it's irresponsible, and I think it's not really part of the healthy debate. I think it's part of propaganda and a communication strategy that has so far been very effective. But it's very hard for me to take seriously, you know, an Iranian official talking about what other countries are doing to destabilize the region.
Why has the Iranian charm offensive worked in part? We think it's also not been successful in part because I think there are clear-eyed influentials and policy leaders out there that are skeptical, frankly, about Iran's charm offensive, which many of us have called it. Senator Lieberman and I have talked about President Rouhani and the effort that they've made to change the view of their country. Why would you say there's a susceptibility to that charm offensive?
No, I think it's human nature to want to believe that either a country can change or a person can change, and maybe Iran isn't that bad, and maybe Iran isn't as aggressive or as expansionist as we might want to believe. And I think someone like Foreign Minister Zarif does a very good job of conveying that. But I do believe that it's also important to look at facts. I think it's important to realize that until 9/11, and again, I'm quoting Mike Morrell, not me, until 9/11, Iran was responsible for the largest number of US deaths between the bombings in Lebanon and the deaths in Iraq that were attributed to Iranian-supplied IEDs. Until 9/11, Iran killed more Americans than anyone else. So I'm equally confused as you are as to why the charm offensive is working despite evidence to the contrary. I don't know.
And we see that some of the historic trading partners, we're going to hear in some of our later panels today a more European perspective. But I think that there's been confusion from the press and from policy leaders in the post-Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action environment. I think that if you were a general counsel or a compliance officer or a chief executive officer of a company that sees Iran as a vast potential market, which I think we all do, that somehow détente, that peace had broken out and that Iran has been accepted back. If you were talking squarely to that CEO or that compliance officer, what would you say to them?
I would say evaluate the economy on its merits. Who's in charge? Who's in control? How is it regulated? What is the market upside? What does the forecast look like in Iran? I mean, but base it on, look, when you go into any country, you do a political risk assessment. What is the political risk in Iran today? I mean, there are companies who specialize in that. And so with that amount of uncertainty, when the country has a position called the supreme leader, who is not elected, you have to evaluate based on that. You have to, so if I make a $1 billion investment, is that investment at risk if that supreme leader comes in one day and says, you know, we're going to nationalize this investment? And yeah, that is a valid point in a country like Iran. Again, and that's exactly why the IRGC has grown dominant and controls up to 70% of the Iranian economy. So I would say to any business who's exploring the idea of doing business in Iran, make your own assessments, do your evaluations, consider what environment you are making an investment in. And again, I will reiterate the fact that we want to see a responsible Iran, much as the same way South Korea would love to see a responsible North Korea.
No, it's a fair point. Many people ask us about our work, and I think all of us would be the first to celebrate an opening of Iranian markets because there was real change in Iran, and I think it's an important point to underscore. If you could talk to us about what we've read about, which is the push-pull between what people characterized as the conservative faction that is trying to prevent a moderation of Iran's behavior, and the so-called moderates that are ostensibly in the Rouhani faction, or even my former colleague at the UN, Foreign Minister Zarif.
Yes. Talk
to us about that push-pull. Is it real? How does it work? What's the dynamic around it? And where does it stand today, post-Jcpoa?
I think it definitely is real. I think it does exist. And I would definitely categorize it as a push-pull. But I think when you say push-pull, you think of, I think of a tug-of-war with two even teams. These are not two even teams. I think there is a moderate faction. There are people who want Iran more integrated with the world, who do want Iran to open up, and who do see the Jcpoa as that opening or a potential opening. But then there is another camp that sees exactly the opposite, that they see the Jcpoa as a form of legitimacy, as something that will give them respect and credit on the world stage while they control the country from inside. And I think that team of hardliners, of the Supreme Leader, of the IRGC, of Qasem Soleimani, of Wilayati, that's a much stronger team in Iran. So while there is another team out there hoping to take it in another direction, unfortunately that team is much, much weaker and doesn't have enough power. And we saw evidence of this. We saw evidence of this in 2009. Many people think that the Arab Spring began in Tunisia, December of 2010. But I would urge you to remember what happened in June of 2009 in Tehran when people protested the election because they felt that Ahmadinejad was fraudulently elected. What happened? Thousands of people were killed on the street. So yes, there's a lot of people in Iran who want a better future for Iran. I think there's another camp that is strongly opposed to that.
What's the best way to empower, as outsiders, what's the best way to empower our moderate voices there? I frequently use the example of the Persian Spring, as you just described, because it was the first example of a rising of people, and there was some criticism about how it was handled across the world. How would you go about, if you were advising the P5+1 or other Western powers, how would you empower the moderate voices in Iran?
I think that's really tough. it's hard to do it from the outside. It really is. And we've seen many experiments in the region and outside the region where regime change, our expectation that regime change then comes and fixes everything. And then oftentimes it makes things worse. So I don't know exactly how to empower it or give it a larger voice, but I do know that it exists. And for any change to actually be sustainable and systematic and actually happen, it has to come from the inside. So as much as we'd like to support it because it suits our interests and because it would make Iran safer, I think our ability to shape that or actually affect it is pretty limited. And we've seen in countries where we've actually had presence, our ability to shape that was limited. So in a country like Iran that's much bigger and has a much stronger history and sense of its own identity, it'll probably be even harder. That has to come from inside Iran. And like you said, there's that push-pull. The prospects for Iran opening up, given what I see today, are pretty dim.
What are Iran's, from your perspective, intentions in the region? We heard the comments from the Ayatollah. We've spent so much time in dealing with this issue. I characterize the Persian people as an incredible people, incredibly warm to the West, in many ways pro-American, in my opinion. What are their real intentions in the region, and how has that gelled a coalition that you have at the GCC and others? Tell me about the effect of Iran's intentions in the region and how you all in the region are dealing with those intentions.
I think, to put it simply, it's dominance. They want to dominate the region. They want to have as much influence and control as they can, and Iraq is a perfect example. You know, when the United States went into Iraq in 2003, no one gained more influence in Iraq than Iran does, and we're still seeing evidence of that today. I think there's probably a subtle or subliminal desire to re-establish the Persian Empire. I don't subscribe to the theory that this is a pure Sunni-Shia conflict. I think this is more of an Arab-Persian conflict. I think the desire to sort of establish a foothold in not just in the region, but in Latin America and Africa, I see it manifest itself, Mark, in a way where Iran behaves as the Vatican for all the Shia people around the world. They want to basically act responsible for any Shia member anywhere in the world, which, as Dr. Kissinger often said, Iran has to decide whether they want to act as a country or act like a cause. If you want to act like a country, you have to respect the Westphalian system of nation states and live by international law. If you want to act like a cause, then you have to announce that you have to act like a cause. And so Iran is trying to do a little bit of both. Operate as a country, but act like a protector of all the Shia people in the world, which causes interference in a lot of our countries. So it's very difficult to deal with.
A Vatican with an insurgency aspect to it. It's an interesting, I might have to use that. So what has been the response? What are your allies in the region, from Saudi Arabia to your other allies in the region? How do they deal with that Vatican with an insurgency in their own neighborhoods?
Well, I think Yemen is a perfect example of that. I think we've seen over the last several years Iran grow stronger in the region. And so the reason we went into Yemen, to be clear, we were invited by the legitimate Yemeni government. There was a UN Security Council resolution, 2216, and we basically decided Iran was not going to get another foothold in the region. It's just not, we're not going to tolerate it. And so I think many countries will react in different ways, and I'll let each country discuss their policies about how to deal with Iran. But I think we're at a point now where we're going to take measures into our own hands when necessary.
We did some polling data recently on sort of the status of Iran and the views on Iran here in the United States, and more than 90% of Americans wanted transparency in any company that was doing business in Iran. More than a majority were very concerned about purchasing goods and services from businesses that were operating in Iran. Do you think that reflects opinions in your region as well? Tell me about the views, if you can. It's always hard to channel, of course, the people of a region or a country, and I'm always cautious in doing that. I try to use polling data. But as best as you can, what's the sense of the people on the street in your region and how they view Iran compared to the polling data that we've recently seen in the United States?
I think more recently with our casualties in Yemen, I think the view of Iran is very negative. But also it started with the Syria situation. If you went into some Sunni countries like Egypt and others, Hassan Nasrallah was a very popular figure, 6-7 years ago, because he was seen as a strong Arab who stood up to Western influence and resisting the Israeli occupation. But ever since Syria began, I think Iran, Hezbollah, and that wing started taking a massive hit in their popularity. And so I think Iran is largely seen in the Middle East today as part of the problem and not part of the solution. Whether it's because of Syria, whether it's because of Yemen, whether it's because of the various activities and support for other groups, I think Iran is probably going through one of its least popular phases in the region.
There was a piece by Vali Nasser recently. I don't know if you saw that. But the argument essentially that Vali made was we have to have closer ties with Iran, and as objectionable as Iran may be, we have to have closer ties with Iran in order to block a nascent and aggressive Russia. What would you say to Mr. Nasser?
I'm fine with having a discussion about how do we have a conversation with Iran, not just to peel off that alliance, but just to have a productive, positive relationship for us. But I would also argue that before we do that, let's agree on what are the criteria. Before we enter that discussion, okay, let's talk with the Iranians, but what is the talks going to be based on, and what are our expected outcomes, and what are the objective? And if we can agree on the criteria before we start talking to them, I have no problem. I have a problem with going into an open-ended conversation where we don't know what we're looking for, and then sort of not having a core objective that we're striving for.
Why weren't those other issues part of the discussion in the Jcpoa? It was my understanding that Iran didn't want to discuss broader regional issues and other issues as part of the Jcpoa. Well, why wouldn't Iran want to talk about those issues?
I'm not sure, but if the discussion was about regional issues, we would have a very tough time accepting us not being at the table. So if we were going to discuss regional issues with Iran, we should be at the table. And if you want to talk just nuclear, we'll trust you to negotiate the strongest deal you can negotiate. But when you bring in the regional issues, you need to bring in the region.
You don't want us telling you how to think in your region.
Well, we don't want a deal that largely relates to us being negotiated without us at the table. So I think, yes.
I agree. One of the big concerns that Americans had as part of the Jcpoa and going forward, and one of the risks that we find in Iran, is the pervasive sense of kidnapping as a tool of, and unlawful detention as a tool of foreign policy and the like. Talk to us, if you will, about your view of Iran's use of that technique in order to extract its foreign policy goals, and what the correct response, frankly, from the West and your region should be.
No, I'm going to pass on that question and defer it to Jason, who's sitting right here in the front row. I think if anybody wants to answer that question, please feel free to ask Jason after the session.
I think Jason's here in a journalistic capacity, so we're going to be very neutral with Jason. But it was interesting to us because I think the American people were very concerned that as part of the Jcpoa and as a continuing problem with Iran, that Iran uses unlawful detentions as a tool of foreign policy. You see that. Is it true from your perspective in the region that Iran operationalizes those unlawful detentions as a mechanism of driving an agenda, or is that part of the push-pull?
No, I think it is part of their strategy, but also so is support for proxy groups. So is developing their missile program. I think there are many facets to their strategy for the region that goes unchecked, unfortunately, and if you take them all, if you connect all the dots, it's a very effective strategy. So I think, yes, the kidnappings are just one element of a very complex and very effective strategy.
what was the effect of the money transfers that were made to Iran as part of the JCPOA? There's been so much in the press, so much discussion about the money that Iran received as part of the JCPOA. Have we seen Iran use that money to reinflate its economy, to support its goals? What do you think the effect of that, of the financial aspects of the JCPOA have been on Iran?
So it's hard to actually gauge where the money is going. We in the UAE don't have transparency into whether it's the sanctions money or the money from the transfers have gone. It's very hard to see where that money goes, and if you look at the IRGC budget, that's a black box, so we have no idea how much of money is going into the IRGC budget versus going into rebuilding the economy. It's very difficult to gauge. It's one of the things we're actually seeking. But once a country gets its money, it's very difficult to kind of track where it goes. What we have seen, which is public, is the military budget in Iran has increased by 10%. And I know someone back home who did a paper on Iranian support for proxy groups, and what they found, this was very interesting, that despite sanctions, even when Iran was under sanctions, even when the rial was very deflated, even when the economic environment was very, very difficult, support for proxies continued at more or less the same level, between $5 and $6 billion a year for Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and a variety of other groups. So it's not an economic reflection so much as a national security priority. This is very core part of Iran's national security doctrine, is support for proxy groups. And so will the extra money go towards these groups, or will it go towards more belligerent behavior in the region? Probably. But I think even without the sanctions relief, that was already taking place.
I think Secretary Kerry, to his credit, even acknowledged that there was no way to ensure that any monies that Iran received as part of the JCPOA wouldn't be used for nefarious purposes, supporting Hezbollah and the like. Maybe there's anybody who wants to ask a question from the audience. We had some cards, or if you have any questions from the audience, but I wanted to just, perfect, Jen, thank you. Question from the audience. There's a gentleman over here, Jen.
Thank you so much. Just let us know your name and your affiliation.
Bernard Leventhal, Washington Institute.
Nice to meet you, sir.
What would your country and your fellow countries, such as Sunni countries such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, what would they wish for the new president's policy in the Middle East, no matter who that president might be?
Well, I think as a general rule, it's unwise to advise or advocate policy. It's even more unwise to do it 2 months before an election. But I think, let's simplify it. One of the first rule of politics, at least as I've been told, is know your base. And I think any president who comes in needs to get a sense of who your base is in the region. Who are your traditional allies? And I can make a very compelling argument that your most important and your most reliable allies in the Middle East have historically been Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Israel. And you know, we can add or subtract a few more, but I think this is a general consensus. I think the first order of business is to rebuild that alliance, is to reestablish that trust, is to make sure that your base is back with you, is to make sure that relationship is as strong as it possibly can be in order to help resolve Syria, in order to fix Libya, in order to stabilize Yemen, in order to fix all the problems we have in the Middle East. I think my advice to whoever comes in, as politically incorrect as it may be, I think is to make sure that those relationships are back on solid footing.
Adam Turner with the Endowment for Middle East Truth. Mr. Ambassador, I was just wondering if you could give us an update on Yemen, exactly what's happening, whatever you can tell us, obviously. especially what Iran is doing specifically in Yemen?
So I think we, in about February, March, had really got to a position where we were ending our battle with the Houthi rebels. And if you remember, negotiations between the government and the Houthis had begun. It dragged on for quite a while, unfortunately a little longer than we thought. The talks broke down about a month or two ago. And so the negotiations, which ultimately will bring the political solution needed for Yemen, is not going as well as we would like. We've largely shifted our fight from fighting the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels to fighting AQAP. We conducted a very large operation in April.
Hello?
We and our allies conducted a major operation against AQAP in April, and it forced AQAP to basically scramble from Mukalla, which were their base of operations in Yemen. So I think at the moment our military operation is primarily focused against the Al-Qaeda threat from Yemen, but it's also going after Iranian-backed Houthi insurgents. And we still, until today, see weapons shipments from Iran going into Yemen, until today. So if anyone's perpetuating this war, it is the continued weapons supplies.
Any additional questions? Please raise your hands.
Any other questions? Okay, with that, I want to thank Yousef. Thank you so much. It's been a great honor talking to you and a great discussion. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Ambassador Wallace, thank Ambassador Otaiba for that very compelling discussion. Our next panel will be starting in about 10 minutes. There's coffee and pastries and assorted snacks out in the foyer right behind you, but we'll be reconvening in about 10 minutes for our next panel. Thank you.